Our regularly scheduled program will not be seen due to the following special presentation.
The year is 1904, and the Pawtucket Fire Department is racing to put out a blaze. 30 years later, an explosion rocks the town of Tiverton. In 1954, the USS Bennington struggles into Quonset Point after a devastating fire at sea. And the world's first woman fire chief. Sure enough, she was a Rhode Islander. All that and more on this edition of NBC 10 Timelines. Hello, I'm Frank Coletta. Welcome to NBC 10 Timelines. Since the dawn of time, fire has been both a blessing and a curse for humanity. Fire can provide warmth and comfort, but it can also bring destruction, suffering, and death. In this episode, we will take a trip back in time and relive some of our most dramatic fires through the eyes of those who experienced them personally. And we'll hear the incredible story of the world's first woman fire chief. We begin November 1st, 1933, the day the sleepy town of Tiverton watched the sky burst into flames.
Less than 30 square miles in size, Tiverton has a special charm all its own. Local residents have long enjoyed the quiet, peaceful atmosphere of this small and closely knit community. In the summertime, the cool ocean breeze, the scenic views, and fresh seafood attract tourists from across the state. But in the 1930s, Tiverton was also a commercial port, busy with marine traffic. As America's love affair with the automobile grew, a storage depot for gasoline was built in northern Tiverton on the shore of Mount Hope Bay. The New England Terminal Company held over 5 million gallons of gasoline and other petroleum products in its huge metal tanks. Charlie Perry grew up in Tiverton. Like most residents, he paid little attention to the storage facility until one fateful day in November of 1933.
I saw black smoke over our head, and that's when the principal came in and said, well, I'm sending you all home. We all went home at 10 o'clock.
Young Charlie Perry joined thousands of spectators watching the fire. Suddenly, there was an enormous explosion.
We went down there no more than 5 minutes. That tank exploded. My father grabbed me by the neck and carried me out the street. And everybody started running, of course. And some people got out of their cars and left them there. And some people had like Monterey Ford convertibles, they just left them there and ran. And it was hot.
There are two types of combustion that are especially dangerous for firefighters. One is a backdraft, an explosion that occurs when trapped gases suddenly ignite. This abrupt, violent expansion of gas causes shock waves that can shatter windows, knock down firefighters, and collapse walls. A second deadly type of explosion is a boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion called a bleave. What took place in Tiverton in 1933 was almost certainly a massive bleave. The accident started when a tank that was being tested ruptured. A spark ignited 1.5 million gallons of gasoline, shooting pillars of fire hundreds of feet into the air. Burning fuel oil poured into the waters of Mount Hope Bay. Mountains of angry black smoke punctuated by flames could be seen as far away as Block Island. The blast killed 3 men, injured a half dozen others, and spread a roaring blaze that resisted all efforts to extinguish it.
The superintendent down there must have knew it, because he told the firemen, go lay down in the gutters and get away from the fire, because he knew there was going to be an explosion. Because the tanks were lifting up the roofs with the heat.
The catastrophe drew a crowd estimated by police at 100,000 awestruck spectators. Roads for miles around were choked with thousands of cars. Oily smoke spread from Fall River to Saconnet Point, while homes were swiftly evacuated. Planes carrying newsreel photographers circled wildly overhead. Below them, burn victims were rushed to nearby hospitals. The inferno continued throughout the night, punctuated by a random series of deafening explosions.
I was scared. I wouldn't go back down there when the fire. I said, that's it. I never went no more.
A proposal to rebuild the facility met with strong opposition from frightened local residents.
They signed a petition not to have it built. People down the hill, but it didn't. They couldn't stop it.
New tanks were eventually built, and a storage facility is still operating today at the site. However, these tanks, owned by the Inland Fuel Company, contain heating and fuel oil, not gasoline. A spokesperson assured us that the Inland Fuel Company has never had a fire at any of its terminals.
Next on NBC 10 Timelines, Fire at Sea, the story of one of the worst peacetime disasters in the history of the Navy. A disaster that took place right off our shores. Join us when we return.
Aircraft carriers. They are one of the most potent weapons in the arsenal of the United States Navy. But these floating cities can be vulnerable, both to enemy attacks and accidents. Hello everyone, I'm Dan Janik. NBC 10 Timelines continues now with the story of one of the Navy's worst peacetime disasters. It happened in 1954 as the aircraft carrier USS Bennington was cruising the waters off Rhode Island. It was a tragedy that altered the way the Navy designed future ships, and an experience that forever changed the lives of the men who served on the Bennington. The idea of building a ship that could serve as a floating runway for aircraft had long fascinated military engineers. But it was during the Second World War that these uniquely designed vessels began to play a vital role in combat. The aircraft carrier USS Bennington launched fighters on daring raids against the Japanese home islands and in support of the bloody Okinawa campaign. After the war, the ship was modernized and recommissioned. Lieutenant Tom Brady was assigned to the Bennington for her shakedown cruise off the coast of Cuba. It was a mission that turned out to be anything but routine.
One of our boilers exploded, and when it did, all the steam came up, and of course everybody that was in the engine room, they were all cooked just like they were all just parboiled because the steam was superheated steam, and they were killed.
Brady was transferred to a new assignment, but when he arrived, there was grim news awaiting him. There had been another accident on the Bennington, and this one was much worse.
And so I drove to Quonset, and the first thing when I drove into the main road into Quonset, I could see all the hearses lined up going down to the carrier pier, and the whole hangar deck was all lined with caskets.
Fluid in one of the catapults used to launch airplanes had ignited. A series of explosions had knocked sailors from their bunks, burst fuel lines, and jammed bulkhead doors.
All of a sudden we heard this big blast at about 6:25 in the morning. And then all of a sudden we saw a big flash of fire up near the doorway.
We can only imagine what it must have been like on board the Bennington after the explosion. But images from fires on other aircraft carriers during World War II give us an idea of the terror created by a fire at sea.
We started rushing for the ladder. I was the third man from the top. The first guy was up there. The blast must have caught him as it was passing through, because he became a human torch. We put blankets on him to cover him over.
The tremendous force of the explosion left many sailors trapped in the sections located below the hangar deck.
When that blast hit, after it flashed through, it took the bulkhead door and fused it shut. So we had to sit there for probably 35, 40 minutes till the damage control people came and broke the door open so we could get out of there.
Injured but alive, Al Charpentier was finally freed from the wreckage inside the ship. Only then did he realize how close he had come to death.
The seamen that were working in the catapult room, they were just blown to smithereens. There was no way you could even tell who they were, because the whole section, all of the bulkheads, partitions, everything was all gone.
Despite his injuries, his main concern was for his fellow crewmen.
They asked me on 3 or 4 different occasions if I wanted morphine, but I told them forget it, give it to the people that needed it.
The damaged ship made its way to Quonset Point, and soon word of the tragedy flashed across the country.
The United States aircraft carrier Bennington, blasted and flame-seared, limps into Quonset Point, Rhode Island after the second greatest peacetime sea disaster in naval history. The dock is a temporary receiving station for the 91 dead and 201 injured. A sudden, unexplained explosion turned Big Ben, as she is known in the Navy, into an inferno 70 miles offshore.
Friends and relatives rushed to the Navy base and anxiously waited for news about their loved ones. Al Charpentier's brother and father are seen here in this Life magazine photograph.
They just kept sitting there. They couldn't see me, even they didn't know whether I was living or dead.
More than 100 men had been killed and over 200 injured. Those in need of medical assistance were flown by helicopter to the Newport Naval Hospital.
I had never seen anything like it before. It was pretty awful to look at because there was so much black charred skin on them. The nurses put lubricated gauze that was sterile on them and made them feel better. Just trying to ease the pain. It was just a terrible shock for them, and they were mostly just not talking at all, just pretty much just trying to cope with these injuries.
This once classified photograph of Al Charpentier shows the burns that he suffered during the catastrophe.
My face, my neck, my hands, and my legs were too, but it burned the socks right off of my feet. You'll notice my eyebrows were burned right off. They never grew back.
As the bodies of the dead and wounded were being taken ashore, Tom Brady entered the ship he had so recently served on. There he learned the fate of the man who had just replaced him.
He was killed sitting at my duty station, so I knew that my guardian angel had been with me.
After weeks of recovery, Al Charpentier reported back to the USS Bennington. His body had begun to heal, but memories of being trapped inside the burning ship were not easily forgotten.
I wouldn't go below decks to sleep. I slept upstairs for 6 months, right in the navigation department.
The Bennington was repaired and put back into service. A Navy investigation into the cause of the accident led to changes on aircraft carrier catapults. The role of aircraft carriers in the defense of our nation seems assured well into the 21st century. Despite increasing complexity, the Navy strives to make them as safe as possible. But it is important to remember that there will always be a degree of danger for those who serve on such powerful vessels. Danger that must be faced both in war and in peace. Next on NBC 10 Timelines, the world's first woman fire chief. It's an amazing story that you won't want to miss. Please join us when we return.
She was born into high society at a time when women were expected to let men do the driving. But Nancy Allen was no ordinary woman, and hers was no ordinary life. Hello, I'm Kelly McGee. NBC 10 Timelines continues with the story of a truly remarkable person who was once known as the world's first woman fire chief. It's a story of hard work, courage, and inspiration, because Nancy Allen didn't just fight fires. She fought against barriers that keep people from achieving their dreams. Nancy Allen was brought up in a home staffed by butlers and maids, but she quickly displayed a strong streak of independence. In a time when women were expected to stay close to the fireplace, she decided it would be more of a challenge to get out into the world and fight fires.
She was extremely independent. She had her own motorboat, and she acquired an airplane and became a pilot. And she also developed her own fire department because the family summer estate in Queeset here had about 500 acres, and there was very little fire protection at that time. So she decided that she wanted to have her own fire truck and develop her own fire department, primarily to protect the estate. However, it rapidly developed into responding to every available fire that came along.
Firefighting is a profession open to both men and women. More than 5,000 women now hold career firefighting and fire officers positions in the United States. Today, individuals who apply for this difficult and often dangerous job are judged on their abilities and not their gender. But in the 1930s, Nancy Allen's position as a fire chief brought her notoriety across the country.
She was for a long time the only woman member of the International Association of Fire Chiefs.
This newsreel footage was most likely staged for the cameras, but by all accounts, Nancy Allen was a genuinely dedicated and courageous firefighter. When it came to helping people, Nancy didn't stop at just fighting fires. She was also a licensed pilot, and when the terrible hurricane of 1938 hit southern New England, Nancy leapt into action.
She started doing rescue work with the Red Cross, and she flew for several days with her plane over the South Shore ponds, helping to locate bodies.
Regardless of how well she performed her duties, there would always be those who challenged her right to be a fire chief, but Nancy Allen refused to be intimidated. Hard hat diving, like the type shown taking place in Narragansett Bay in 1929, was considered a dangerous task for even the hardiest of men. When the state's fire chiefs gathered to test similar equipment for possible use in body recovery, Nancy Allen attended the demonstration. But to everyone's amazement, she was not there just to watch, but also to test the equipment herself. It was another first for this remarkable woman. Newspaper headlines at the time often referred to the 30-year-old firefighter as a girl. And no doubt there were those who snickered at her bold attempt to enter what had once been considered strictly a man's profession. But the laughing stopped in 1938 when a deadly forest fire that covered 6 square miles spread across Coventry, Rhode Island. Over 1,000 volunteers and firefighters were battling the blaze that threatened to destroy homes and businesses. As high winds whipped the flames into an inferno, 20 men found themselves trapped in a ring of fire. All hope seemed lost until Nancy Allen, riding in her own fire truck, fought through a wall of flames and rescued the firefighters.
She did save several of them. She became very involved in rescue work and in fighting forest fires around the state.
Nancy married Monterey Holst, a graduate of the Oregon School of Forestry who came east to show New Englanders how to fight forest fires.
They left on their honeymoon on the Cedar Hill Fire Department fire truck. And that's one way that she used the fire truck for something other than fighting fires, I guess.
Nancy's daughter Anne says there is no doubt that her mother led an extraordinary life.
Very full life for somebody at that period, because of course a society lady would have not been expected to be running around in the woods fighting fires.
Nancy Allen died in 1997 at the age of 89. News of the passing of this remarkable woman brought sadness to a multitude of people whose lives she had touched.
We got a tremendous number of letters from the governor on down and from people around the country that had known her.
Perhaps you're wondering what became of the fire truck that faithfully served Nancy and the people of Rhode Island for so many years. Well, it's still there on her estate, waiting only for some tender loving care to put it back into action. If someday you hear the urgent wail of its siren, listen closely, because it's singing a tale that should never be forgotten. Today, women are joining fire departments in ever-increasing numbers. But it was the world's first woman fire chief, Nancy Allen, that blazed the trail almost 70 years ago. Stay tuned. NBC 10 Timelines will be back in a moment.
This is the Pawtucket Fire Department galloping to the rescue at the turn of the last century. The equipment may be primitive by today's standards, but as we found out, the dedication to duty remains unchanged nearly 100 years later. We wondered who in these parts had been putting out fires the longest, and we think we found him. Joe Juris has been a member of the East Greenwich Volunteer Fire Department since 1937.
Today's modern firefighting equipment is vastly superior to what Joe Juris had to work with when he joined the fire department almost 65 years ago. But, as he is quick to point out, some things never really change.
It seems archaic today when you look back to where you operate on, but you still put the fires out.
Over the years, he has been more than willing to share his knowledge and expertise with the next generation of firefighters.
As I always say, I don't care. The young can't get along without the old, and the old can't get along without the young. Because you can tell them, teach them, and just keep passing it on.
So why does a man who is approaching the age of 90 continue to put his life on the line fighting fires? Joe says the answer is simple. He enjoys the challenge, and he welcomes the opportunity to lend a hand to those in need.
That always attracted me for some reason, that you felt like helping somebody. I just felt like I'd do something to help out.
We hope you enjoyed this program, and we encourage you to email your feedback to us, care of Timelines, www.turnto10.com. I'm Frank Coletta, inviting you to join us again next time for another edition of NBC 10 Timelines.
For information about purchasing a copy of this program, log on to turnto10.com or call 401-455-9100 during regular business hours.
Hi everyone, it's Patrice Wood from NBC 10. Thanks for checking out the NBC 10 WJAR YouTube channel. Click the links on your screen for more stories from across southern New England. And don't forget, hit the subscribe button below to get notified anytime we post an update on YouTube. As always, thank you for turning to 10.